forever be grateful to him for the opportunity he gave me to serve. As a citizen, I will never cease to admire him for the dedication and commitment he brought to his job. Please join me in welcoming the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, President Rabinowitz, Mr. Smertz, Secretary Albright. Thank you for once again proving the ultimate wisdom of another one of Clinton's rules of politics. Whenever possible, be introduced by someone you have appointed to high office. They'll lie about you every time, and it'll always be on the high side. You can argue all this flat around. The only thing I ask you to do, indeed with me or any of my predecessors, is to make sure you've got the facts and then make sure you've weighed them properly. One of the American historians I most admire, Mr. Brinkley out here, is sitting here, was quoted in the paper today as saying that I would be viewed as a great president except for the fact of impeachment. It was just there. So one of the things all of you have to do, for example, is decide how you're going to deal with that. Now, I told Doug before I came up here I was going to say this, so I'm not catching him unaware. I completely disagree with that. I think you can say you think I was not a great president, never mind impeachment, or you can agree with his statement, but only if you think the impeachment was justified. Otherwise, it was an egregious abuse of the Constitution and law and history of this country, and I should get credit for standing up to it. Because the statement that I or anybody else, Andrew Johnson's impeachment was not justified. But the statement that any president should be judged based on a fact, whether or not that represents good or bad policy, good or bad action, I believe is flat wrong. That was the gamble Gingrich took. I'll never forget the conversation he had with my chief of staff, Erskine Bolden. Erskine said, "Newt, aren't you being a hypocrite on this?" He said, "Sure, what's that got to do with it?" He said, "Well, you don't have the votes." He said, "I will have by the time we get through whipping them." He said, "We'll offer them what we got to offer. We'll take away what we got to take away. We'll get the votes." So he said, "You recognize this is not justified by law or fact." And let me remind you, this had nothing to do with my misconduct. This was about whether I lied to the grand jury and obstructed justice. Now remember this, and I could not have obstructed justice without lying to the grand jury, because that's what the grand jury testimony was about. And so there's one person coming here who voted for obstruction of justice and against perjury, and you ought to ask him how he did that, since the whole testimony was about obstruction of justice. And we proved that the person for the House who represented that case on the floor of the Senate, Mr. Hutchison, did not tell the truth about the chronology, and proved it. So it's still bad, and my reputation should suffer. Now, if you want to hold it against me that I did something wrong, that's a fair deal. That has nothing to do with this impeachment. Then, if you do that, then you have a whole lot of other questions, which is, how many other presidents do you have to downgrade? And what do you do with and you got a lot of other problems. What are you going to do with all those Republican congressmen that, had problems? And you have another problem, which is, what about other issues? Does that count for more than, for example, the Nixon enemies list? Or a man I very much like personally, President Reagan. I'm a Southerner. It was hard for me to get over the fact that he decided to announce for re-election in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered, and tell everybody with a wink and a nod we were going to go back to states' rights. Everybody knew what that deal was about. I still like President Reagan. I admire a lot about him. But you never hear anybody mention that. But I'm a white Southerner. I grew up in that time. It hurt me bad, bad. And I'm not quite over it yet. So how are we supposed to evaluate this stuff? I'm not saying, if anybody wants to stand up and condemn me for what I did and say I should be written down in history, that's fair. That's your judgment. But then you have to deal with all these other problems. But to give Newt Gingrich what he believed we would all do, which is to stop thinking and legitimize an egregious abuse of power in the Constitution by saying the fact that it happened is a mark, whether it was justified or not, I think that's not good for America. If you think it was the right thing, then stand up and say it. If you think it was wrong, don't pretend that it should be given weight. That's what I think you have to do. And not just on this. I think this is true on anything. Just a couple of other brief points. I think that we did a good job because of the extraordinary role that Al Gore played and the unprecedented role that Hillary played in the administration. And in some ways, I was criticized for both. So when President Bush let Vice President Cheney have a big role, if you don't agree with Vice President Cheney, that's one thing. Most of us Democrats don't agree with what he did. So we should say that. But we shouldn't act like, as some Democrats have and some commentators have, that George Bush is somehow diminished because he vested great authority in a vice president with whom he agreed and who had great expertise. In other words, if you don't agree with what he did, say you don't agree. But I personally believe, since no president can possibly hope to do everything he or she is supposed to do, it's a good thing to enlist smart people in your common cause. And it's crazy to have the vice president do nothing but show up at the Senate when there's a tie. So I'm making a case here again. You know, most of us don't agree with Vice President Cheney's positions on a lot of issues, but I do not begrudge the president, nor did I think it was a sign of weakness that he wanted his vice president to play a large role in the governance of the country. That is a sign of strength, not weakness, to find somebody that you believe, that you agree with, and that you want a partnership with. That's what I did with Al Gore. That's why I asked Hillary to do things that she knew more about than I did, where I thought she could make a big difference. And I feel very strongly about that. So you'll have to think about all these things. All I can tell you is I'm really old-fashioned. I changed the economic policy because I thought the other deal defied arithmetic. And it still does. Look what's happened. I believed that ideas mattered, that execution mattered. I tried to have good people like Madeline with me. I tried to respond to the crisis. But the most important thing to me is when somebody comes up to me and tells me they got off welfare when I was president and got a job and they're raising their kids. Or when a woman in Ghana came up to me in 2001 waving a shirt because she had a job at a shirt factory because of the African trade bill and gave me the shirt. When a man came up to me here at this place today and thanked me for the federal family leave bill and said he thought it would never happen in his lifetime. I went home to Arkansas the other day and I was in church and a guy came up to me and he said, you know, remember I got the family leave bill. He said, you know, my wife died last month, but I had her for several years and every time I was eligible, I took some more time off the family leave and got to do that. And I could give you lots of, that's how I keep score. So a lot of this stuff people say that they think is so important doesn't amount to a hill of beans to me. And I have no idea how history will regard it. The only thing I ask you to do is be factually accurate, contextually fair, and don't accept what seems to be on the surface. And if you don't agree with my tests, have your own test. But have your own test and have the facts. To me did the president state with clarity the current challenges? Did he offer a vision for the future and a plan to achieve it? Did he execute the vision? Did he respond to the crises that were unforeseen? And were people better off when he quit than when he started? That's way the most important thing. And I'll go to my grave keeping score that way. So I expect to have a smile on my face. Thank you, and God bless you.
I'm going to present you with a degree, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. President, we think it's long overdue that you become an alumnus of Hofstra University. President William Jefferson Clinton, as the 42nd President of the United States, you have shown an extraordinary commitment to promoting equality and economic opportunity at home and around the world. You presided over an unprecedented era of prosperity through economic expansion, investments in education and technology, legislative reform, and job creation. Through the establishment of the Clinton Foundation, you have worked tirelessly to bring quality health care to those in need around the world, to build international partnerships, and to raise awareness about important global issues. For your many extraordinary achievements, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees, we are honored to bestow upon you the degree Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa.
Are we ready to quit? We are ready to quit. I'm going to come shake hands. Okay. Yeah, Doug, we can take care of this. Yeah. Thank you. We're adjourned.
He's going to shake some hands. President is going to shake some hands. Right?
Why do you think that's the case?
You know, I think there are two reasons. Pragmatically, you know, you really have to be committed to this. This is a tremendous effort. This one conference took 5 years of planning in terms of hundreds of people, number one. And so you can't do this casually. You can't do this off the cuff. You've really got to make this an important centerpiece of your academic program. And I think the second reason is our prior conferences have been so successful that people haven't seen a vacuum. The vacuum, you know, the space has been taken, and, you know, instead they come here.
And bring assistance from our own government. She championed the cause of the Afghan women who were suffering unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Taliban. And at one point, the NSC staff brought me a cable that had come from the Taliban leadership saying, Mrs. Clinton is wrong. We want her to come to Afghanistan and see the good conditions under which women thrive here. Obviously, they were very concerned that her speaking out this way was going to keep them from being recognized both by the United Nations and our own government. She met with the Dalai Lama to talk about the trafficking would have been adopted without her concerted leadership. Most important, perhaps, Mrs. Clinton led the charge to make women's issues central, not peripheral, to U.S. foreign policy. And this was by all the demonstrated evidence that when women are engaged in the economies and the political life of their country, governance prospers, the economies prosper, countries prosper. It was in our interests. And with Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State, they became a tremendous partnership on these issues. Secretary Albright directed all the embassies to include women's issues as part of their standard reporting, which continues until today, and supported the Women's Office at the State Department, which also continues to today. Secretary Albright
might close them again. And she had also played the role of the quiet behind-the-scenes diplomat. You know, we had the 50th anniversary at the time of NATO. It was very important that NATO presented an extremely unified front, and it was Hillary's job during that evening to talk to Francis Chirac and make sure that he did not stray from the rest of the alliance when it came to the bombing. She would later play that role with the Prime Minister of Italy, who was asking her if we please could have a pause in the bombing, which was disturbing tourism and which was not popular for him at home. She would hear she would hear from opposing sides, from first ladies of the region. But perhaps her most important role, once again, was that advisory role to the president, that eyes and ears. He, at that point, could not go to the region. And so it was up to Hillary to go and not only bring his message to both the Macedonians and the Albanians, but to also be his eyes and ears and find out what was really happening. It was often surprising to the folks on the plane, especially
men, for most of the 8 years of the Clinton administration. For most of this time, these two people were close friends and partners in the very best sense of the word. Clinton was a brilliantly instinctive politician with, as we saw yesterday, an unparalleled ability to convey empathy in public. And yet in private, he was often had a tendency to be disorganized and indecisive. Gore was a formal politician who came across as wooden and, even worse, sometimes condescending in public. But he was organized, he was decisive, and he was wise in the ways of Washington. And the two of them really had a quite remarkable relationship up until the time of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And that, I think, was a break in their relationship, which was too bad for both of those men. But that bond of trust was, in fact, broken then.
You want government to leave you alone, to stay out of your lives. So tonight I say to you, goodbye and good luck. Indeed, President Clinton appeared to be, like President Kennedy, very much aware of the prevailing economic mythology and the subtle ways in which such tendencies played out in the political arena. Americans are conditioned to think optimistically, he told aides early in his first term. Republicans overcome their numerical disadvantage by selling the hope of wealth and keeping the voters in line through their expectations. Adding that even a lot of low-income people think they pay capital gains taxes, Clinton concluded that identifying his administration with the middle class and their interests, a stance that he would have preferred, and setting them against the wealthiest Americans and their safekeeping would ultimately prove to be a rather fruitless political strategy. As an avatar, the Democratic leadership
should have tried to puncture these bubbles. I recall back in December of 1996, Alan Greenspan made a faint-hearted attempt to puncture what was then a rising stock market by his famous speech in which he mentioned irrational exuberance. The market promptly rewarded his concerns by going up 50% over the next few years. Piercing any bubble, especially the stock market bubble, in my view, could have been dangerous. It could have led to a collapse.
As a relevant presidential figure in American politics, paving the way for his 1996 re-election campaign. Clinton's use of the Oklahoma City bombing to resurrect his political viability transcended simply performing well as mourner-in-chief. The president was successful at merging the thematic dimensions of the tragedy in Oklahoma with more pedestrian concerns of domestic politics in ways that made the bombing a larger metaphorical frame for understanding complicated questions about the very nature of government. Now, presidents confronted by national trauma who need to offer a therapeutic rhetorical response make significant choices about that response, choices that are
spent 4 years on active duty, another 20 in the reserves, and then dealing with the Pentagon. I can tell you this: no matter what you want to do, the Pentagon will resist it, whether it's a social change or thing. But you've got to be strong. You've got to fight them, and in the long term, they're very happy when you do it. Just give you an example. They fought like heck against increasing the opportunities for women in the military. This year, when people wanted to pull back, they said, no, we need them out there, you know, we'd lose the war. Okay, quickly on the...
our aircraft that's being sent into training patterns in terms of destination. I can't think of a more difficult matter.
Problems of education? Of course not. And these were really the kind of defining initiatives of the Clinton presidency. Why blame the media for focusing on them? In the same way that the defining statements of the Clinton presidency were the era of big government is over, and it depends on what your definition of ease is. Hardly statements that are going to set the world on fire. And what is really problematic is that this was a man of such stupendous gifts, both gifts of seduction, which you need as a president to seduce an electorate, gifts of persuasion, gifts of incredible wonkiness. As everybody here alluded, he could discuss the arcana of bills and policies in a way that reporters loved, in the same way that, as John Alter pointed out, he could stay up all night, which again reporters love, because there is somebody who can stay up all night and be interested in them and be interested in ideas and policies and, you know, sleeplessness as a symbol of ultimate presidential virility, as opposed to President Bush going to bed at 10 with his pillow. So, yeah, that was it.
And it actually was in the awful office giving the president cover and saying it's really, we don't know who should blame, we don't know what's happening. And he's kind of covering his appetite for
the last day here. Well, it's been a wonderful experience to meet academics and scholars and professionals who were involved in either directly involved in the Clinton administration or involved from the standpoint of assessing it. But it's also been a tremendous amount of fun to interact with the students themselves in Hofstra, to see how they reflect. Because while people of my generation and others, you're right, the Clinton administration's not too far away. For the students that are coming to college today, some aspects of the Clinton administration are ancient history. And so it's interesting to see them reflect on this, engage in this. I think this has been an extremely worthwhile process. And I describe, again, based on firsthand experience, the policies of the United States at the time of the Clinton administration. I call this book the Rosetta Stone. If you read this book, it will all be clear what the policy of the United States was vis-a-vis disarmament, meaning we did not support disarmament in Iraq. Disarmament was a tool for the real policy objective, which was regime change in Iraq. The devastation that economic sanctions had not only on the people of Iraq, but on the reputation of the United States around the world, and how the Clinton administration actually set in motion policies and events that facilitated George W. Bush's war in Iraq. I think this is a very... First I was disappointed because I was like, gosh, we've gutted this thing, we've gutted the story. But in stepping back and then rereading it.
Most every reporter the president ever met he liked. Many of them he respected, and respected greatly. And he liked the process. Preparing the president for a press conference was something that I don't know that he'll admit to it, but I know he looked forward to. Doing the press conferences, I know he liked. The interaction, the one-on-one interaction or in a press conference was something he enjoyed. But ultimately, what soured the president as a whole was his distrust and dislike. And dislike is probably too soft a word for the institution as a whole. And I think I mentioned before John Kennedy and this idea that this was an era of great expectation. And I thought this is an area, looking at the president, where this comparison is useful, both for where it does work and, more importantly, where it doesn't. John Kennedy, as far as I can tell, and not being a historian, certainly seemed to have the warmest and most positive contemporaneous press in modern history. Clinton, like Kennedy, arrived as a fresh-faced, young, optimistic, charismatic, and a new generation taking the mantle of leadership. So I think there was a real sense of optimism. Both of them shared what I view as a genuine respect for the role of press in our democracy, something not shared by all presidents, in fact, shared by few presidents. They believed that the public had a right to know what was going on in their government, and the press was their appropriate proxy. And they both understood that they needed the press in order to generate public support that would help move their agenda forward. Beyond those simple points, I think the comparison breaks down, and I think it's instructive.
Served the president as press secretary from 1998 to 2000. To give you some perspective of what it was like and the environment, my first day walking into the briefing room at 1 o'clock for my first briefing.
No one in at least in my history as an American, has been more practical and pragmatic than Bill Clinton. He reminds me a lot of what I've read of Franklin Roosevelt. Practicality and pragmatism, whether it's trade or foreign policy or domestic issues, has to be the cornerstone of what you do. You have to see the world as it is, not as you want it to be. And you have to work with what you have in order to move the world forward, in order to serve the American public, which is, of course, your responsibility as a president. And personal involvement is critical. As we talk about engagement, I'll mention that many times in my few minutes here today. The President of the United States must be personally engaged. It's not enough to be a CEO as president. You don't push buttons and make the American government go. You don't move on the Balkans. You don't move in Ireland. You don't move in trade deals. You don't move the Congress of the United States in, as Dick will tell you, when you're trying to move legislation, unless the president is personally involved on almost a 24-hour basis. And Bill Clinton certainly was a man of...
So many directions, there was always something to cover. And he brought us back with him and understood how important the press was and how important it was to cater to the press.
The president in the campaign in '96 and then as press secretary.
What was done with Bill Clinton's impeachment was terrible for the country, because what it did was it crossed a line which had only been crossed twice before. One was with Lincoln after the Civil War. The country had just gone through a horrible Civil War, and if it was ever a time there would have been a crisis, it would have been then. And then with President Nixon, where you had all this movement within the government, the whole Watergate conspiracy. But other than that, we never crossed that line of impeachment. And to cross it on such a trivial matter, I think it has permanently poisoned our politics. And this is where those of you who applauded me then probably won't applaud me now. I think it's also irresponsible today for people to be talking about impeachment when it comes to the conduct of the war against terrorism. You can have honest policy differences. You can disagree completely. But if we really want to start looking into everything the CIA is doing, everything that's going on in every prison, if we had done that in World War II, if we had done that during the Korean War, it could have undone our country. I'm not saying people should be let off, and I'm not saying we should look the other way, but when you start talking about impeachment, after the election we went through last year, just as we went through the election in 1996, after Bill Clinton's first term, to attempt to undo that for what I believe can be honest differences of policy in a very, very dangerous world is, to me, going down a very dangerous path for our country, and we will become close to become a parliamentary system of government where you lose a...
Ladies and gentlemen, the historic legacy of the Clinton presidency, for all the reasons you just heard, is that it was a good to great presidency, and this affair with Monica Lewinsky isn't even going to be an asterisk if you judge presidential performance. And the expert on the subject of legacy are not us, and it's not talking head pundits, and it's certainly not the hate mongers like Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter or any of the others that you hear throwing food on television. It's the American people. They made the judgment on performance, and that judgment is that this man was a great president, as far as I'm concerned, on achievement of what he did for the economy, what he did in global trade and standing up to the base of his own party on significant issues. And I think in the long run, the trivial nature of what we're talking about in this panel will be seen by most historians. Thank you.